This is something that is impressive to me because it's like we've changed the meaning of things over time, even with God. God, if you look at him in his ancient Near Eastern context, and then you see what happens after Plato gets his hands on the world, then you see God become this Platonic or Aristotelian, like you're trying to make the unmoved mover, the first cause, all of this stuff, but it wasn't that way before. And so I would love to have you springboard off into whatever area of this discussion you want to go.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. There is a lot of work in philosophy written about like the God of the philosophers versus the God of the Bible or the God of the Abrahamic traditions.
Right.
Very often the God of the Abrahamic traditions is depicted as mutable, is depicted as changing his mind, is depicted as in time, is depicted as having certain emotional outbursts and just being outraged at things, regretting things,
Yeah.
is almost just depicted in very, very anthropomorphic terms. Whereas you look at the kind of God of the philosophers, and it's this like almost impersonal. I mean, it's like almost impersonal, borderline impersonal reality. This transcendent, timeless, immutable, immaterial, spaceless, like impassible, so it doesn't have any it can't be affected by things outside of itself. It doesn't have fits of rage or things like that. That is in stark contrast with how the Bible and the Abrahamic traditions depict God. So there's this question of how are you supposed to reconcile these things? Are these two different like beings? Are they two different deities? Are they the same thing? Are we just using is this transcendent being just condescending to our condition in the biblical texts and things like that? So God isn't really anthropomorphic in these ways that he's depicted. There are all these really interesting questions that you can
Yeah.
explore. So for me, because I am inclined to the more philosophical side of things, what I want to do is just, even setting aside whether or not the God of the philosophers is the God of the Bible or the God of the Abrahamic traditions, I want to look at, is the God of the philosophers even coherent? Does it exist? Those sorts of things.
I love it.
Yeah, exactly. So that's, I mean, it complements your approach, like just
Right.
looking at the biblical texts and pointing out certain tensions within them and the ancient Near Eastern context and things like that. That's one way to go about investigating these questions, and it's a useful way. It's a beautiful way, in fact. And then there's another way where you could just look at the philosophical foundations of the views that these people are putting forward and just target those. So I think these can complement one another pretty nicely, and they can play off one another. So yeah, in my work, I've explored the kind of philosophical conceptions of God, and there are different conceptions. Some of them you could say are a little bit more anthropomorphic than others, but they're still philosophically robust, philosophically serious. The one that we take issue with, or the one that we take aim at in the book, is this kind of high octane classical theism, which springs out of Platonic tradition, Aristotelian tradition, things like that. And yeah, you are viewing God as this unmoved mover, unchangeable, impassible, so cannot be affected by anything outside of himself, doesn't have any passions, timeless, so doesn't undergo any succession, doesn't do one thing and then another. There's no like succession in its life. It's also absolutely simple. So everything inside of this thing, everything intrinsic to it, is identical to it. So this being, God, is identical to his omniscience. He's identical to omnipotence. He's identical to his goodness and things like that. So God just is his omniscience. He just is his omnipotence. These aren't like distinct properties that are kind of like attached to him. Instead, he just is these things. So like this is where you often hear people say like God is being itself or God is goodness itself. They're getting at this idea where everything in God is numerically identical to God. So that's kind of the conception of God that we're taking aim at in this book. This kind of what we call classical theism, and what philosophers at large call classical theism. So yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of the laying the groundwork for the discussion to come, I guess.
There's so much you said there, and I had like so many ideas to throw at you. If God is goodness, is this thing itself, then what you mentioned in the opening of your book, then what about the problem of evil? Does this not require dualistic understanding, or does this not mean that there is then God is had if God is goodness, then what do we do about evil and its existence? Because like how did it come to be from this? You see what I'm trying to get at? Like,
Yeah, no, that's good. So, oh, this is great. So you can distinguish between what's called the metaphysical problem of evil and the Oh, I don't know what the other. I mean, it's just the problem of evil simpliciter. So let's get a new term for this. One of them is the metaphysical problem of evil. Uh, let's call it the problem of metaphysical evil. Let's call it that. And then the other one is just the problem of evil. Okay. So
Okay.
the problem of metaphysical evil is, yeah, how do you get like evil kind of arising from something that is perfectly good? So if God is goodness itself and being itself, you might wonder, like, surely it would then only produce good things, right? If it's goodness itself, and if it produced bad things, it's like, where did that come from?
That's
There's some sort of yeah, there's something in the effect that like goes beyond its cause in some way. So there's a sense in which like, yeah, it's not contained in it. It doesn't have the wherewithal to even produce that because it's goodness itself. So there is that kind of intuition. And so yeah, so if evil really does exist, we have this problem, this metaphysical problem. Now, Augustine had a famous solution to this. What he says, he has this privation theory of evil. The privation theory of evil says, okay, strictly speaking, evil does not exist. Now, be careful, right? He's not saying that tornadoes don't happen. He's not saying that people don't suffer. He's not saying that cancer doesn't happen. That's not what he's saying. Rather, what he's saying is he's focusing on the ontological status of evil. Is it some reality? Is it something? Is it something that we have to say that there is such a thing as that? Like, do we have to commit to the existence of evil? And what he wants to say is, no, actually, what evil is, it's a lack of something. It's a
right.
lack of a do good. So you can consider, for instance, blindness. Blindness isn't some like positive reality that's, someone gained some reality, as it were, when they
Mhm.
become blind. No, actually, they're just lacking something. They're lacking a do good, namely the good of sight, something like that. So, under this view of evil, evil doesn't really exist. It doesn't have positive reality. It doesn't have being. It doesn't have oomph. It's not there. But still, we can say that, there's a sense in which we can still say bad things happen. It's just when those bad things happen, we analyze that in terms of the absence of a do good. So, that's how they try to get around the metaphysical problem of evil. We can go down that in a second. I just want to briefly talk about the problem of evil, which is
Sure.
that other horn. And that's not really asking, it's not asking about like the metaphysical status of good, of evil, right? Because the problem that we just went over is like the metaphysical status of evil. Like if evil really is a thing, like it is there, how could that like come from something that is pure goodness, right?
Right.
Pure goodness doesn't have the wherewithal to produce that, as it were. But this other question is basically, well, if it's the standard problem of evil that you come across. It's not asking about the metaphysical status of good and evil. It's just saying, okay, listen, who cares if evil is a privation? There's still privations around us. There are bad things occurring. Like that's undeniable. How do you reconcile that with the fact that God is perfectly good, knows about this evil, and has the power to prevent it? So that's basically the problem of evil. You're not asking about the metaphysical status of evil. You're just asking about like, well, this seems really surprising under the view of God, on which God is omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly good. So there are these two distinct problems, and I think it's good, firstly, to have them in mind that they're distinct, and then we can kind of go down each horn. So, briefly on the privation view, going down the metaphysical problem of evil. I find the privation theory of evil very implausible. If I'm being honest with you,
Yeah.
okay, fine. Maybe it works for cases like blindness, or like you chop off my arm and there's an absence of an arm. But like the pain that I experience, that seems to be like intrinsically bad. Just the pain that I experience when you chop off my arm. And if that's intrinsically bad, if that's not good, if it's evil that's occurring, then Augustine is going to have, and proponents of this view, the privation theory of evil, they're going to have to be committing to the idea that this pain doesn't really exist. But that seems really implausible. Like I just seem directly aware with this mental state of mind. Like this is there, the pain is there. I can feel it. This isn't a mere absence of something. It's not like the mere absence of pleasure or anything like that. I'm just directly aware of my pain. I'm aware of something. It's there. It's a mental state. It's a conscious property of mine. And in that case, right, it seems as though we have something like a bad, something like an evil, and it has some kind of positive reality. So that's a traditional problem that's been leveraged toward the privation theory of evil. It's the problem of pain, and pain seemingly being intrinsically bad and having a positive ontological status. So yeah, that's one of the biggest problems. And there's a huge literature on this, but I think it's a good objection ultimately. So that's on that horn. Let's go down the other horn, which is just the problem of evil simpliciter. Yeah, on this one, I think we can return to the preface that you read. to me, I think the most powerful form of this problem of evil is the argument from evolutionary animal suffering. I mean,
Yeah.
listen, sorry, creationists, but evolution occurred. Okay, I minored in biology, and we went through so many like different pieces of evidence, peer-reviewed papers, and oh my goodness, it's just staggering. The evidence that we have in favor of evolution. So we know that evolution occurred, and what that means is that there have been hundreds of millions of years of vertebrates. So these are sophisticated sentient organisms. They have a spinal cord. They have, the wherewithal that,
Nervous
like,
system.
yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
nervous system. They have this wherewithal that we see around us in the mammals and vertebrates that we see. So vertebrates have been around for like hundreds of millions of years, and they've been ripping each other to shreds. They have been, preying upon one another. There have been parasites that infect them and that cause them agony. A lot of them have just starved to death. Many of them have burned to death. Many of them have drowned to death. That's like not cool, right? That's like not cool that if there have been hundreds of millions of years of this. And in addition to that, think about if God exists, right? God is like weaving creation together. He is bringing about biological diversity. He's actively involved in this process. He's bringing about humans eventually so that he can have a relationship with them, conscious creatures, right? Or conscious, rational creatures that he can have a relationship with. That's kind of the pinnacle of this whole process. So why would you? This is the very means mechanism by which, just imagine, like it's like a kindergartner just like playing with like ripping apart like beetles so that he could just like use them to decorate his Barbie house or whatever. Like that's not the mechanism. That's not the means by which you do that, dude. Like that's not cool. And so like the very means, the very mechanism, the very engine by which God brought about his creative ends of bringing about biological diversity in general and humans in particular, is fraught with suffering, death, predation, parasitism, languishing, all these horrors. That is so overwhelmingly surprising to my mind under theism, that there's this perfectly good providential being that orchestrated this process. And this is the very means by which God did this. And of course, keep in mind that these are non-rational creatures, right? It's not as though the pig, when the pig is suffering, or the pterodactyl, when the pterodactyl is being ripped to shreds by something, it's not as though it's like exercising its free will or growing in virtue. It's not like, oh yes, I've suffered and I can reflect on it and grow in virtue and things like that. It's like it's definitely not doing that, right?
Right.
It's just suffering and then it dies, right? So like a lot of the responses with respect to human suffering and human evil is definitely not going to be applying to this case. And there are no conscious creatures, like humans aren't bringing this about.
Right.
It's
right.
the animals themselves that are doing this. So it's like free will, no. Soul building, no. So this is a problem, and this is really what kickstarted my ultimately my going away from the faith that I was brought up in, and it's just a very serious problem by my lights.